Welcome to No Nonsense Nonprofits. Hi, I'm Sandy Ray, founder of Sandra E. Ray CPA, where we alleviate financial headaches so that you can create a bigger impact. Today, we're going to be providing a review of a sample narrative for a budget. And I'll answer a few questions on budgeting. I want to go ahead and share my screen with you this morning so that we can go over this budget overview. And I've got a very simple budget here for a multi-year grant where we've allocated expenses based upon the work that we've already done in major categories. For example, personnel. We've looked at our allocation for over 5 years, looking at the growth that we're having. And this growth includes not only maybe a growth in the size of our staff, but also a growth in salary dollars, compensation dollars. We have benefits, supplies, travel, training and development, technology, evaluation and data management, some indirect costs, some in-kind contributions, and matching funds. And we've provided that to you in a couple of graphical interfaces right here. I think this one's I like the best. It gives you the cost and how it's changing for each category over the 5 years. And then over here, we have a budget narrative that's more for your information. Sometimes you may want to include that on this page as well for your board and internal purposes so that they understand the things that you're doing. For example, for personnel, we've listed who the roles are for the personnel cost and that we've included a 3% increase annually to retain staff, ensure program delivery. So that's just a very quick overview of the 5-year budget. Obviously, this can be way more detailed. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to go ahead and answer some questions that we have. We've got no live questions right now, but I'm going to pull up the questions that I received prior to this broadcast. So I have a little bit of ability to go through some of the questions and come up with some answers. So the first question I want to address is, how do you budget for inflation in multi-year grants and incorporate cost of living kind of things? So when cost of living, like if you're going to be giving cost of living adjustments, you're going to be putting that in your inflation factor. What I like to do is I like to take last year's information and come up with what we think the cost is going to be based upon the year that we're working with now. And then I add to that our inflation and our cost of living adjustment. And you may have to do that for each year. And the way you determine what your inflation factors are is go to reliable sources. You can look at past inflation factors at the US Bureau of Labor Statistics and other reliable sources like maybe your investment manager. You can talk to them. Maybe they have resources about what they predict inflation is going to be in the future. And you can use that reliable source to estimate what your costs are going to be in the future years. And of course, every year you're going to have to add, if we think inflation is going to be 3% next year, and then 3% the year after that, you have to increase those last year's cost by 3%. So year one may be increased by 3%. Year two is going to increase year one numbers by 3%, and so forth and so on. So it's just going to build on each other. But again, get those from a reliable source. It really is the inflation factors, the consumer price index are all, there's experts out there that look at that all the time, and you can get information from really reliable sources. I've got a question about what's the best approach for handling currency fluctuations on international grant-funded programs. So you may have some expenses in other countries where the actual cost could fluctuate based upon the currency fluctuations between the US dollar and that currency that's in the country that you're going to be working in. And as we know, those, just like stocks, and everything fluctuate from day to day. Sometimes they remain fairly steady, but they do, again, fluctuate from day to day. But when you look at them over time, some of them remain steady, depends on what's going on with the economy. But again, go to some reliable sources, look at the past history, determine what you think those foreign currency exchanges are going to cost your organization. And then I would create a foreign currency exchange expense, and I would book those currency exchange transactions in that expense, and I would budget for it in that expense line item. So you can maybe look at your supply cost or your transportation or your travel costs based on US dollars. But then when you had to pay for those things in the foreign currency, those exchange rates are booked in a different account. And then the next question is, how do you allocate shared administrative costs across multiple overlapping grants without double dipping? And that's really important because we do want to allocate our administrative costs to our various departments, our programs, and grants when they're allowed. So there's two ways to do this. We can allocate administrative costs with each transaction, or we can do it at the end of a period, like the end of the month, the end of the quarter, the end of the year. Either way, it's going to be done based upon an allocation methodology where we're going to determine a reasonable method to allocate those costs. So for salaries, we may be looking at time. If we've got our staff doing time reports, we could use actual time. We could also use budgeted time. If we anticipate one staff member is going to be 100% on this grant, they may be direct costed exactly there. But maybe you have somebody in administration who's supervising that person. How much of their time are you anticipating that supervision is going to be? And then that supervisor's time can also go to that grant, assuming the grant allows for that overhead. Okay. Occupancy costs, they can be based on square footage based on how the space is used. So if you've got a big room that you're using for programs, obviously many of your grant funded programs are going to be in that space. So that space gets divided up among the costs related to that space gets divided up among all the grants and the programs that are conducted there. Technology, usually I like to do that based upon the number of devices, like the number of computers, the number of telephones, however, whatever your devices are. Internet, the same way, the number of devices that are connected to the internet and how those devices are used. So you can get into some really fine detail. Starting to run out of time, but I did want to address one more question. Can you build a reserve fund into a grant and do it legally and ethically? And the answer is it depends on the grant. If that's what the grant is for, is to help you build a reserve fund, then yes, definitely you can do that. But you must be clear that's what you're doing. You can't do things like inflate cost and hide that attempt to build a reserve fund. That would definitely be illegal and ethically wrong. And I think I have time for one more. How do you budget for staff attrition or turnover in a long-term grant? Certainly that's going to happen in maybe a 1-year grant, but definitely in a multi-year grant, especially like a 3 to 5 year grant. And we know that there are costs associated with attrition and turnover. We have severance for staff that are leaving and training of the new staff that there's costs associated with that. So while these costs may not be specifically built into your grant budget, or if they are not specifically built into the grant budget, you're going to have to cover those with operating costs. But there are some grants, maybe you know that you're going to be gearing up for a new program. And so you build those hiring costs and training costs into the grant. Or maybe you have temporary staff for a summer program, for example. That training, bringing on the new staff, that can be built into the cost of the budget. Just be very clear with your narrative and your grant budget in your application. That's what's happening, and that's where these numbers are coming from, and make those decisions with the grantor in advance. So I have gone a little bit long. I apologize. I hope this information was helpful for you. And if you have any more questions, we are happy to answer them. Just put them in the comment section below. And of course, we always appreciate your likes. And I want to thank you for joining me today. Remembering, creating a bigger impact starts with stopping the nonsense. If you're dealing with nonsense in your nonprofit organization, we'd love to help you cut through the noise.